Okay, can you hear me fine? Thanks. I want to first thank Angelos and the members of the Center for inviting me and allowing me to participate in a very interesting workshop on a very timely issue. On saying that, I am the classic example of what happens to a laggard when there are people who operate on the first mover principle. So the topics earlier in the session I feel I could speak more clearly to and have done research on, but I was asked to do a topic where actually my focus is not here. Nevertheless, if we see this as an opportunity, and I hope in doing so to link the first session's papers with this session's papers, I want to focus my talk, and to use John's language, really on what are the opportunities available to the European Union as an actor beyond in the negotiation arena dealing with the UN framework. Furthermore, I want to talk a little bit about that differences between those opportunities and the capabilities, to put a twist on Hill's capabilities and expectations gap. I share with, look, I've done co-authored things with Rudy and Andy for about 12 years now, so you'll see us talking to each other in various ways, and in the first two slides, without consultation, are sort of echoes of what was discussed before. Do I have to? No. Right hand. Yeah. Okay. I would differentiate myself a bit from the focus on leadership, because I think, in a sense, my view of how the EU approaches these things and how things work is there's a great deal of incremental, unconscious engagement that overlaps over a number of roles in any given leadership context. And if I wanted to distill what I think are some of these key roles, I want to emphasize in saying that I think these roles overlap, they intersect, sometimes they reinforce each other, sometimes they conflict. I see sort of four roles that I want to highlight in this presentation. The first role is one that I'm going to put to one side really because John's covered that, which is the realm of political bargains, the focus on negotiation, facilitating compromises, working on consensus, making deals. The second one I will touch on over the course, so again, we have had it in a number of the presentations, which is this focus on the EU providing examples of good process, if you accept that. Not everyone would. We've discussed questions of legitimacy. Focus on policy solutions and other knowledge which might help us address climate change. And I sort of put this on the rubric of the EU acting as a moral example. The third area is one that, again, we've talked about to some extent in the earlier sessions, is this focus on the EU as a knowledge broker, providing solutions, perhaps even defining the problems that the international community looks at to try to come to some response to climate change. And finally, and one I really want to, I think, in the end conclude with, at the end of this presentation, the focus on the market. And here, talking not simply about the market consuming things, consuming fossil fuels, et cetera, which has part of the EU's global political impact, but also the role in how the market is structured in the EU, how that sets standards, sets rules that have an impact on the rest of the world. Now, in talking about that, I know some of the authors in the EU studies focus a lot on sort of EU as a structural power, hard economic strength and resources. But I want to caution against that because, as was evidence of a special issue by Patterson in Environmental Politics, even within the market context, you see linkages of questions of knowledge, how you frame questions of what is a market in a climate change aspect, which is have considerable ideological issues, And in the EU case, I would argue, much of the focus on the symbolic role of something like as they called in the States, cap and trade, but here, the ETS in the EU context. In looking at these, you see a kind of focus on the importance of knowledge, the importance of rules, and the importance of markets. I also want to weave into the talk the question of money. But my argument essentially is that money is the smaller partner, the smaller instrument in these scales. And on one level, that might not be a problem, particularly if we focus on mitigation, constraining of emissions, and so forth. But I think linking with the earlier discussion about adaptation, the EU, again, in terms of having global influence, where there is less money and in economic recession, even smaller amounts of money, the ability to shape adaptation throughout the world is a problem that the EU, in terms of its leadership roles, is not best suited to deal with. In a slightly different way from Andy's presentation focused on sort of the policy paradoxes at the heart of the climate change. In terms of thinking about my remarks, my own personal focus is more on the institutional paradoxes, which I think shape, sometimes in a positive way, the approaches, the things that the EU is willing to do, its ability to make connections with the rest of the world, and sometimes hinders or contradicts various of its particular pursuits of policy. The first perspective is the traditional one, raising the sovereignty issue, but more sophisticated than a simple international relations look at sovereignty. It's the recognition of the tension that's perpetual between centralizing tendencies and more local state or even subnational tendencies. And again, I think we can see that as making discussions and debates in the EU difficult, but at various times it has worked in its favor. I think some of the discussions you see with similar federal organizations, well, not similar, but federal organizations like the United States, that tension and nuance has given EU policymakers some ability to link into some of the politics going on elsewhere. The second is something we also talked about earlier today, which is this question of the kind of the specialization, the functional organization of the EU, and the potential positive reinforcement, but also the potential for quite significant contradictions within the EU system between the different policy sectors. The third focus is on what I would call, and we've talked about it both in Rudy's and Andy's paper, the focus on the implications of institutional complexity. Now, I think I might disagree in emphasis from Andy on where to put community method versus intergovernmentalism. I wouldn't tend to put them on a continuum, but certainly they are part of the same package. And from my perspective, the EU has these sets of sort of processes, some that are more linked to particular areas of climate change, but it also has the potential for sort of having other arrangements and measurements. And I would like to label those as differentiated integration, where to some extent the expectation is that different bits of the EU are going to reflect different dimensions, that some of the EU states may not be fully into a part of a process, and in getting into talking about the UK and its potential exit from the EU. My own view is that the EU, although it has complex systems, also has inherent in it certain flexibilities and certain long-term traditions of differentiation that allows it, in a sense, to act as coping mechanisms. There's centralizing tendencies, but at the same time, there's the realities of a lot of the expertise necessary for the EU to conduct business rests within the member states and in other international organizations like the IPCC. What I'm going to do now is really take you through what I see. Well, I'm not really going to focus on negotiation because John covered that, but really highlight opportunities that I see where the EU has the potential for having an impact, and then sort of juxtapose that with the little evidence I've found so far for how much of a capability it has in this area. So if we look at moral examples, I find this a particularly interesting area. Now, John's covered a lot of that, but I think it's worth pointing out that the EU actually has a longer track record of getting stuck in the negotiations. And I think we see in areas, common agricultural policy being a classic example, the late negotiations, where the EU had an expectation of its role that we set a good example, in part because that there was substantial working out of disputes between the member states. They go into the international arena and expect all the concessions that the EU has made to then be recognized by the rest of the world and form part of the negotiations, where in fact that position didn't provide the EU with any particular leverage, or not the leverage that they hoped. And I think we see that kind of repetition in some of the dynamics, for instance, of the trying to extend the aviation sector into the ETS, where the EU is trying to push forward, and now you have the United States and China in particular pushing back, and you have a reaction to these particular dynamics on the part of the EU. So while that dimension, I think, exists across a number of the EU efforts of negotiation, as well as making use of its policy instruments, and you might argue that to some extent it may not work in the way that EU actors hoped, there are other opportunities and avenues as well. It's worth remembering that the EU has a substantial and very future-oriented project with respect to neighborhood policy. And there is an environmental dimension. Now, this is an opportunity. Based on the evidence I've seen, I haven't, maybe people can correct me, but I haven't seen a lot of academic research into this. A lot of this is at a fairly small scale in terms of money. There is some interactions at the civil servant level, but in terms of transforming the policy of countries in this group, part of the ambiguity, I think, in something like the neighborhood policy is that from the very start, you had two different views of what it was. From a kind of Sarkozy point of view, this was the alternative to enlargement. And if neighborhood policy, in a sense, moves down the track of being simply an alternative, the EU has much less leverage on these neighbors. But if the EU moves down more of the track, again, this ambiguity about how it's going to differentiate the countries around it and integrate with these countries. If it takes those countries and sees the neighborhood policy as pre-accession, which states like Poland have argued in the past, then this becomes a potential vehicle for actually trying to force on the neighboring states certain climate change modifications, certain climate change commitments. Now, I don't see that at the moment in this issue, but I think it is something worth mentioning. And just to link it with something I'm going to talk about in about 5 minutes, You have also the whole issue of pipeline politics, trying to secure the European energy supply, which could also give some of these questions some teeth in the future. If we look at some of the other issues, efforts at the EU trying to give a moral focus, a number of these efforts, and I'm going to focus on two, often have quite a regional dimension, trying to recognize and reach out to other regional organizations. Here I focus on the African Union, but we also have the Latin American, both Mercosur and the other regional cooperation in Latin America. And we see the EU trying, in a sense, I think there's a wider tradition in the EU of trying to push regional models, and as part of that, showing how the EU fights particular issues, how it tries to deal with climate change issues. And another EU tradition, which I'm glad to see is still alive and well, is trying to come up with over-elaborate acronyms, which is a long-standing EU tradition, which hasn't died yet. But on the basis of an Lima agreement, trying to shift money into research projects, particularly in the areas of adaptation, how these countries can link development policy with environmental policy. Interestingly, here we do see some effort to recognize the importance of adaptation and getting these countries to work on this issue. But the money in relative terms is not that particularly great. And indeed, I think it is clear in the EU's and the Commission's documents with respect to the climate change agreement that they hope that the member states will, through their overseas development aid, push money into this area. And perhaps over time, as the EU, if the EU does in fact go to this budget commitment of 20%, the EU may in fact be able to shift more money into these avenues. Again, I would argue on the basis of what we see here, that this is a relatively small resource of money. Just shifting to the next category, I'll need to speed up a bit to stay under my time limit of 30 minutes. Another area which we've talked about earlier today is the question of innovation, the role of knowledge. And we have not only what the EU itself and its Environment Agency generate, but also the individual member states. Now, I won't go into that in any detail, but I think it's worth highlighting, again, in terms of the differentiation of integration, that something that the organization, the European Environmental Agency, is not simply 28 member states. This is an attempt to bring in monitoring on issues like climate change for a wider set of states in the European context. So we have examples here where Turkey is probably going to be perhaps more fully engaged in the short term on information trading on climate change than you might expect otherwise. Shifting to the question of not just knowledge sharing, but actually trying to share definitions of, well, not just definitions of the problem, but also how you address climate change. I'm particularly in my research interested in the sort of US-EU relations. And it's interesting to note that under George, in the Bush world that Andy mentioned, the EU moved to talk to states and cities. And that kind of understanding of the sort of shifting to who you talk to, the EU did exploit and build some good relations with states in the EU, as well as Canadian provinces, for that matter. Interestingly, with the rise of Obama, this discussion has sort of dried up a bit. It's still there, but it has dried up a bit as EU negotiators have shifted back to looking towards the White House and the federal level. Nevertheless, there is still talk of trying to engage. Francesca mentioned the EU Commission's interest in linking to Australia and its scheme. There's a lot of talk both in Washington and in Brussels about trying to link the EU scheme to the Northeast version, which differs from the EU version in that it only focuses on power stations. In contrast, California has just gone online last week with its attempt to deal with all major emitters of climate change. So we may have a case again where, although in Washington there is little chance of an agreement between the Republican House, the Democrat barely, control of the Senate and Obama, nevertheless you have the possibility of the EU through the linkages it's made in the past and currently moving forward with, at least talking of moving forward with some of the subnational actors in the US. Now that's not to sugarcoat the US situation. The Northeast is about to lose New Jersey, even despite the hurricane. The Republican governor is pulling out of that scheme. And the Western scheme, again, the Republican governors in the Western scheme pretty much don't want to buy in. But the reality of the importance of the Californian market, I think, will tell over the time, even in the West. And just has everyone heard the fact that the state legislature in North Carolina made it illegal for any policy discussion to consider an extrapolation of the sea level rising above a certain percentage. It's illegal to discuss this in a political or policy context because essentially both houses were worried about the effect of development on the outer banks of North Carolina. So climate change denial has been ratified by the North Carolina legislature. Another set of policy solutions that I think is worth talking about focuses less on sort of trying to deal with the environmental solutions of trying to reduce climate change, but trying to push industry, push technological advancement, things that might lead to reductions over time. And so the example I've focused on this chart is the carbon capture and storage directive, where the EU, certainly if you look at these numbers, has certainly put a lot of money forward, unlike, I would argue, to some extent, the other areas that I've looked at so far. Interestingly, just in terms of the directive itself, the EU focuses that this is a bridging effort. This is an effort to bridge the questions of how you deal with carbon usage and reducing it at the same time. Although the EU has put out this money and has created these opportunities, in terms of the actual projects, for instance, the large one that Francesca mentioned, at the moment, it only looks like one project for CCS is actually going to get funded. And within the EU this past year, there have been no new projects. In contrast, if you look at China, there are 5 new projects. All right, so we mentioned in the earlier session about how China is taking a leap in terms of renewables. I think you can argue that a similar situation is developing in terms of this technology and the ability of the EU to maximize its leverage, again, is quite limited. I want to shift then to the last category of sort of roles and focus on the market. And to first of all emphasize that while we've talked about environmental reductions, the reality means that much of what the EU is doing at both the high political and at the low political role, if you want to still make that distinction, is dealing with energy security and supply, with a great deal of geopolitical implications, quite important ones. So on the one hand, you have an engagement, cooperation between Russia and the European Union to try to talk through issues to secure EU supply. But at the same time, you have something which is particularly seen as a threat in certain Russian quarters of trying to create a whole alternative geopolitical sphere to the point where the EU is willing to consider that there's a mandate for a treaty with Azerbaijan to enshrine this. So in terms of large political impact, I think this story has quite a considerable ability to, in comparison to some of the things I talked about earlier, to shape the politics and the international relations of the EU for some time. But of course, this is focused on really consumption and security of supply. In contrast, the EU has, you can also see as not just a market consumer, but also as a market regulator. And we've talked about it earlier in today's session, but the European Union has, and certainly has made the commitment to bring aviation online. As we've discussed earlier, the US and China in particular have reacted against this. 3 US carriers went to the European court. All right, the ruling went against them, but the clear focus that this particular market access question gave to this issue has moved this into the realm of very high visibility global politics. To the point, again, where last week in the US House of Representatives, they ratified a bill making it illegal for the for the US carriers to pay emissions flying into the EU. And that is the context in which we have this kind of temporary stalemate between the EU position and the external carriers, particularly the United States and China. Now, in saying this, this isn't the only example, though we've talked a lot about this. I think there are other areas where the EU is trying to use this mechanism. An interesting one that I flag up as being worthy of future research is the forest law enforcement and governance and trade, which is an attempt to try to preserve rainforests by excluding from the market questionably sourced rainforest materials. Now, the degree to which this is monitored, the degree to which this is enforced, I think is subject to question. But in the context of where the EU is, I think this is much more of a potentially strong market mechanism for the EU to have an impact on, on the international politics. So I'm just going to conclude with this last slide. You have, in the context of the opportunities I've talked about, policy efforts that I would argue do work against each other. So you have this movement towards pipelines, which in the long term you could argue will enshrine carbon emissions. At the same time, you have efforts at adaptation. The money differentiation is quite severe. At the same time, you can have reinforcement between these roles. So you see the use of the EU not only of trying to get the ETS to be a bargaining chip, but as a sort of a declaration of its moral example. In the longer term, however, my own analysis would be that while the information and knowledge over the long term, and many of these policies are only 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, may have a significant impact. In the light of the studies about climate change and the likely sea level rise, their more immediate ability to shape these politics and to help with adaptation are severely limited. I think the area where the EU, and we can see it in the ETS, actually stands to have its larger, more significant impact is through the question of market consumption and market standards, where it has quite a large weapon. This is in keeping really with the EU tradition, because I would argue, if you're looking at EU environmental policy from the 70s onwards, it is often the case that it is through these dynamics that the EU has really pushed itself forward. Does that really allow us to get at adaptation? I think that's a big question. I think these same dynamics, by the way, will work in the United States over time. If California manages to convince itself it's a success, you have more states in the United States doing things. And I think the solution in the United States will come through the states doing things, annoying big business, and big business then going to Washington, D.C. and asking for a federal solution. So this, I think, is where the capability is strongest. But in terms of how long the world has to wait for these things to track and to work in the context of the climate change situation, I think there's a big problem. Okay, thank you very much.